Interview has got your personal background, then we will talk about the music, we'll talk a little bit about education, and we're going to talk about lifestyle, dealing with the stress and maybe some injuries, and we will talk about your equipment and the gear that you've got there. And feel free to step in at any point and share any story that comes up to your mind. So you were born in Canada. Whereabouts in Canada were you born?
I was born in Winnipeg, right in the middle of the country. So I lived there for, until I was 17, and then I went to university at McGill University, which is in Montreal, and I did my studies there, and then stayed there for 3 years afterwards, just kind of playing and playing locally.
And what kind of major was it? What kind of major?
It was a major. It was in music and performance.
In performance, okay.
There was McGill in those days. I think it still does have one of the few jazz programs in Canada. I mean, there are a few of them. There's one in Toronto, or a few in Toronto, and one in Halifax. But at that point, it was like very well respected at McGill, and it's still very well respected. It's a good place. So yeah, that's where my early playing experiences with other musicians all took place. And it's really where I learned how to play, or how to start learning how to play.
Do you remember in your hometown where you were born, what kind of scene was there in terms of what was the mainstream music people were listening to?
Let's see. I mean, there was a small jazz scene, but I was never really involved in that because I was so young and I couldn't play at that point. So I never got to play with any of the local musicians, until I came back years later to visit or whatever. So, I mean, there were lots of bar bands and like blues rock bands, I don't know, like rock, a lot of rock. But again, I wasn't super interested in a lot of the more mainstream kind of music at that point. Like really in high school, I caught the bug for jazz, so I was really listening a lot to that. Only later on did I become more interested in folk and country and rock and those kind of things. But when I was growing up, I kind of wasn't into it. I was just listening to Coltrane and Bill Evans and stuff,
Do you remember when you were very, very young and you started playing piano? Was it a process of, hey, I will figure it out by myself, or your parents just went one day, hey Bryn, here's a surprise for you, here's a music lesson, and your first introduction to your instrument was through a teacher or through your own experience?
Well, I actually started relatively late. I started at around 12 years old, which is kind of late for piano, as you know. And the reason why I started was because I had this cassette tape of J.S. Bach Goldberg variations played by Glenn Gould, and I would that over and over and over again, and I was obsessed with that. And so I bugged my parents for piano lessons. So yeah, my first piano lesson. I think we bought some kind of crappy keyboard that I started on, and I would figure out little songs and stuff on my own. But yeah, my early experiences were certainly with a teacher,
A teacher.
Starting from 12, yeah.
And do you remember, did your learning experience come from you got a song and you played a song, or you took a song and you realized, okay, I have to work on the rhythm, I have to work on the chord changes, I have to work on the phrasing, the melody? Did it come, in separate packages like this? You go.
No, I think at that point I wouldn't have even been able to conceptualize what all of that meant. I think I learned the song from the sheet music, or really mostly by ear, and just learned these songs week after week. Different songs, some pop songs, some short little classical things, some little jazz things as I kind of got a little more advanced. But I don't think I would have been able to say I really need to work on my rhythm, or I really need to work on voice leading or something. I didn't know enough about music at that point to be able to isolate those different elements.
What do you think is the most important moment, person, or an event in your entire music education?
There are too many to list. It could be, because I feel like I still get important advice from all sorts of musicians, peers, and people that I play with. I mean, for me, certainly an early influence in college. I listened to Fred Hirsch a lot, the pianist Fred Hirsch.
Fred Hirsch, yeah.
And I remember, in college, we went down with a big band to perform at what was then the International Association of Jazz Educators. And I saw Fred, in the elevator of the hotel, and he was, my idol,
So you met him personally? Awesome.
Yeah, well, I met him personally, and then I hit him up for a lesson. So I remember going to, and at this point I was probably 19 or 20. I didn't know really anything. I was just learning how to play. I mean, I could play a bit, but, so that, I remember certainly that was a really good experience just in I had never really interacted with a musician of that level, in a lesson at all. I mean, the teachers that I taught with or that I studied with in school were great, but they weren't on records that I listened to all the time that I was obsessed with, and so certainly getting to know Fred and having him teach me, and I wound up taking many lessons with him over the years, and we still are in touch, and we'll talk and go hear him a lot, and he always has kind words to say about my playing, which is very nice. But yeah, Fred Hirsch was definitely an early influence, in terms of how seriously he took music, and how can I put it? He's not the type of teacher to hold your hand through a lesson. You know what I mean? He'll definitely tell you. Sorry, he'll definitely tell very honestly what he thinks about your playing, what he thinks you need to work on. So for me, getting that kind of real feedback from a master musician for the first time was certainly very influential. Yeah, that's one example. But I mean, I still feel like I get that a lot with some great players, and I try to get as much as I can from the musicians that I play with and the musicians I admire. So it's kind of hard to pin it down to one.
What collection of instructional material do you think every student should have? So imagine a first-year student at a university. I come into a lesson with you, and I will ask you this question: what kind of books, as a piano player, maybe even as a composer, should I get that will guide me through certain years?
Yeah, that's a good question, because I haven't really... the last time I really used any kind of textbook was when I was in college. And so after, I know that people swear by the Charlie Parker Omnibook or things of that nature. So I'm kind of trying, I didn't really, let's see. I remember actually there was one book that I got early on that was helpful, even only because of the discography in the back of the book. It was called The Jazz Piano Book by Mark Levine.
By Mark Levine, absolutely. I think I have it here somewhere on the shelf.
I remember that for me as a 17-year-old or 18-year-old, just in college. I think I got it even before I went to college. It would just opened up this world of oh man, who's Herbie Hancock? You know what I mean? Or who's Ray Bryant or whatever? You know what I mean? They would have different examples of how different piano players played. But I remember he also had this really great discography of here's some records with Bill Evans as a leader. Here's great records with Bill Evans as a sideman. Here's some Hank Jones records you should check out. Here's a compendium of Bud Powell you should be listening to. So for me, I remember that resource being particularly important. Especially in as much as it led me to the great recordings, which of course are the real resource for any jazz musician, and continue to be the real resource for a jazz musician of any level, So that one comes to mind, Apart from that, really the most important resources for me have been the recordings, and trying to transcribe things or learn tunes or things like that.
Okay. Well, what was the longest time you were away from the piano without playing?
Well, let's see. Most recently?
It can be recently, or it can be at any given point in your lifetime.
I mean, I don't like to go too long without playing piano because I start to miss it. And also I feel like the more I practice, the more interested I am in music. You know what I mean? I sometimes feel like even if I take a couple of days off, like if I don't mean to, or if I'm busy with something or traveling, sometimes when I'm on the road, it's actually hard to practice, you know? I mean, it's different, of course, because I'm performing, but I don't have time to like sit there and work on something, or even just sit and play something that I feel like playing. Honestly, the last time I can remember being away from the piano for more than a week was after the last tour that I did with Lage in Japan.
Okay.
My wife came to Japan to join us for the last concert or so, and we had just been married, so we had our honeymoon in Japan. After that. Okay. So that was about like 8 or 9 days with like no piano playing. But I had just finished this tour with Lage, so I was like, that was a good time to take some time off, you know. You
had a good mileage, you know, under your feet.
Yeah, exactly. I felt like we earned it, and it also like we were in such a different place that there was so much other stuff to think about and see and experience that I didn't mind being away from music that long, you know?
You see, I think a lot of students cannot relate to how long they can stay away from a piano until they start losing their dexterity or maintain their skill, right? And it's obviously very individual to, you know, every person's need. I don't know, there was like a rumor that, I don't know, a hoax that I remember. I was born in Czech Republic, so I think there was somebody saying that if you don't practice, I don't know, for 2 days, your musicians, you know, can tell, and if you don't practice for a week, the audience can tell, or something like that.
Oh yeah, I've heard similar things like that. I mean, you know, that may be true in certain respects. I mean, I feel like a lot of times if I take a day off or 2 days off, and then go into like a different kind of playing situation that's relaxed, I can find that really refreshing. Because I'm not thinking about the mechanical aspect of what's going on. Like a lot of times when I'm practicing, that I'm focusing on that, like, oh, I should be working on this or working on this element of sound or rhythm or whatever. Sometimes if I can come into a musical situation slightly removed from those technical concerns, then my ears will turn on a little bit more. You know what I mean? One thing that I do feel like, and I've actually talked about this with Lage, is if I stay away from playing with people too long, my ears get lazier, you know, because I'm only listening to myself practice, you know. So the less that I interact with other musicians, I feel like the harder it is for me to then get back into the mindset of really listening carefully. And I have to like flip that switch in my head and just remind myself, like, oh, you're not listening. Like, what are you doing? You're not listening. You're on autopilot. You know what I mean? So I think that's, you know, it's good to take some time away. It could be time away from practice, but the more time I take away from actually playing with other musicians, that takes a toll, you know, yeah.
I liked your answer about your passion. You know, the moment you stop playing piano or you're away from piano, you start missing it. You know,
well, it's not always true. Sometimes if I'm going through a period where I'm depressed, or if I feel a little hopeless about music, or I'm not inspired, then sometimes it's really hard work to practice. You know? But I would reiterate what I said before, is like the more I practice, the more I want to do it. You know, so sometimes it's just like, you know, it's like rolling that boulder up the hill. Like initially, it's like really, really hard to like spend 15 minutes, even if it's like playing scales or whatever it is, you know. But then once you kind of get the momentum going, it's better, and then that can be inspiring of itself, I think, you know, in and of itself.
What inspired you to compose music? To come up with elements, different concepts for each album. Is there a moment? I'll give you an example. For me, if I hear other musicians playing and there's something I like about their playing, I take that element. It could be textures of the sounds. So I go, I really want to include that in my band, right? So I get influenced a lot by other musicians. How do you get influenced?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that that's similar for me, for sure. You know, if I'm listening to something, I'll be like, oh man, I want to write a tune like that. Like, how can I incorporate that, you know, that sound or that vibe into my, you know, how can I write a tune that's kind of like that? That can definitely be a source of inspiration for writing tunes. But a lot of times I write tunes because I have to, because I have a gig coming up and I have pressure on myself to like have something new for it, or I have to put out a record or want to put out a record, and there's like limited time to, you know, I want to have some new material out there. So a lot of it comes from pressure that I put on myself just to do it, you know. like, man, Lage, I don't know how he does it. He writes so much music, and it's all really, really good. And he writes really, really quickly. And it takes me so long to write tunes. And even then, sometimes I'll write tunes, and I'm like, man, I can't even play this, you know? Not because it's too hard, but just because I'm just not that familiar with it yet, you know? But yeah, Lage, that's an example of someone who just like churns out really good music all the time. I think maybe just because he just is that way and isn't afraid to try different stuff, and you know, but maybe that's a kind of roundabout answer. That's more of a comment than an answer to your question. But yeah, I mean, I would agree with you that for me, a lot of it is like, oh, maybe I'll hear this thing, this tune, be like, and I'll lift the tune or learn the song or learn this little harmonic passage, and then that can be a source of inspiration for my own compositions for sure.
Do you remember recording these albums? I'll just read it from here. By the Moon and the Stars, then Night Song and Fables. Now, how long each album was being prepared for? You know, the moment you sat down on the piano and you started coming out with the ideas, and did you spread it out throughout the whole year, and occasionally you would meet up with Lage or you would meet up with the other musicians, or did you just made 1 week off and, you know, for first 3 days rehearse, go to studio, then have a gig, or how would you come about with this?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I guess, well, I can address those records with Lage first because those are the most recent. So Hide the Moon and the Stars, there was no rehearsal. Well, actually, no, that's not true. We had one rehearsal and we had a gig at Mesro. And then we just did 1 day in the studio. So that was how that one came about. So it was, but you know, also that's the second record we did together. So by that point, we'd been playing together a while. But you know, so a lot of that material was actually new to both of us. But we have a certain baseline of like an idea of like how it is to play together. You know, so even if the material is new, there's a sensibility that we share, and there's kind of an approach that we both take, and don't have to talk about it too much, which is the thing that I really like. So that one was almost no preparation. I kind of almost could have used more time with his tunes and more time with my own newer tunes. The record before that, same thing. 1 day in the studio, maybe one rehearsal. But I always like to do a gig before, you know.
Okay.
It's nice to do a gig or like at least something or a couple gigs just to see what it's like. A lot of those problems, or a lot of the songs may seem great on paper or under your fingers or whatever, but certain things don't work, you know, when you get together to play them with other musicians. The record before that, Fables, I had taken a long break in between that record and the record before, which was a record called Ludlow. Yeah,
Ludlow.
Yeah, so that record came out in 2004 or something, and then the Fables didn't come out until 2012. So I took a really long time in between, and during that time I was like, there was a period where I kind of got like a little bit dark on playing jazz music, improvised music, and I was kind of playing a lot in the singer-songwriter world and playing a lot with rock musicians and playing with different artists who were doing that. So I was on tour a lot with musicians who were playing that. I kind of got like just tired of this very insular, very snobby jazz scene.
Gotcha.
And so I was kind of in a different direction musically for a number of years, and really kind of didn't even want to play it, you know, which I kind of regret now, but it was, I think, something that I had to just go through just you know, I mean, I don't regret it in the sense that I actually got a lot of other skills as a musician, playing different kinds of music, and also being on the road a lot and touring and being in different situations. And I learned a ton from playing, you know, with singer-songwriters, with rock bands, and I still do that a lot, and I like it, you know. But the long answer to that question is it took so long to kind of have some other tunes. And in fact, guys like Orlando and Lage were like bugging me about it. They're like, you got to put out another record, you know? You write these nice tunes. You should they're like, it's going to be such a waste if you don't put out another record. So that one, I took a little more time and got the tunes together. But it was a similar sort of thing. I had one gig, or maybe didn't even have a gig. But I had played with Seamus before a lot, and Jonathan Lake I had played with, and Orlando was like really in my corner for that record. So So yeah, maybe we had one gig, and again, one day in the studio. I mean, I've maybe done one record where I had more than one day in the studio. It's such a luxury, you know, to have that kind of time.
How do you like setting up your piano? You know, when you're in a studio, let's say if you start with Laga, so in a duet situation, where do you like to arrange, you know, let's say even in a room, how are you thinking where to find the piano, what mics, where to put them, what makes you feel comfortable?
A few records that we did with no headphones, which I really liked, you know, so it was just the two of us in a room. I was just kind of, there are some videos of it too, if you want to see. There's like some videos of the actual recording session that are on my YouTube channel. It's just, we're just sitting across from each other with no headphones. And so I can hear everything he's doing and he can hear everything I'm doing. And for me, that's the best, you know, like playing with no headphones is great in a recording studio, but it's that's kind of not a very common thing that you can do, especially with a larger group. So you have to get used to playing with headphones as well. But yeah, I mean, for those two records, we just set up, they were in different studios, but we kind of set up relatively close to each other and, you know, maybe aimed his amp a little bit away so it wasn't going right at the piano mics, you know. And then he also used like a mic on the guitar itself.
On the guitar itself, I think everyone's seen
and a mic on the amp. So which is why he gets this beautiful sound. Like there's like kind of acoustic element to a lot of it, or you can hear some of the more of the attack of the strings, you know, that is nice. In terms of like how I don't know anything about how you mic a piano or what sounds good or what doesn't sound good, you know.
What kind of sound?
I don't know the recording process. I just know that certain times I've had good sounds on piano and certain times I've, you know.
But when you're, let's say, mixing and then mastering, what kind of sound do you picture in your head of your piano? Are you looking for spacey sound, trebly sound, mid-range sound, bassy sound? What is it that your ears can hear for your sound, for your voice?
I like a rich piano sound that's on the darker side, something not too brittle, you know? Sometimes I hear pianos recorded a certain way and it sounds like I can hear, first of all, you can hear the pedal mechanism engaging and disengaging. I don't like that, you know. I like there to be an illusion of like a more of a bloom of sound. Like Fred Hirsch's sound on records is amazing, or Bill Levin's sound on record, or you know, or Herbie's sound on records is absolutely incredible. You know, there's like a darkness, there's like a kind of sumptuous sound to it. You know, like I love Chick Corea's playing, but I don't always really love the way his pianos sound. You know, and it's kind of his sound and also the way that he gets a sound out of the piano and the way those pianos are mic'd, and where it's very bright sounding and very brittle, you know, and percussive. I like a little bit more, and that's not to take anything away from Chick Corea. Don't misunderstand me. I love his playing. You know, it's just for me personally. Like I kind of go towards the romantic, darker side. That's kind of what I dig more. You know.
Okay. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. So when you were, let's say, with full band, Seamus, Orlando, and Jonathan Blake, right, on drums.
Yes.
How did you set it up in your studio? How far were you away from drums, or where did you like to set them up just visually so you can see everybody?
Well, yeah, sightlines are important for sure. Yeah. And actually, I got lucky on that recording session too. We did it at Systems 2, which is now gone in Brooklyn, unfortunately. And they had, you know, it's a big room. So the piano was like in a big room by itself, and then Seamus was over to my left behind some baffles, like clear baffles, so I could see him. And Orlando was like all the way to the other side of the studio in a bass room. They have a kind of dedicated bass room. And then Jonathan was kind of to my right, sort of like past, also far away, behind baffles. And luckily, I think did I use headphones? No, I must have used headphones for that session, of course, yeah. But yeah, I mean, for me, it's like sight lines are the most important thing. And then if you're playing with a band, like getting the right mix in your headphones is super important. You know, because it's never going to be perfect, and it's never going to be as great as like playing in a club or something like that. So the sight lines, yes, particularly are important, especially if you're needing to cue things or, you know.
Absolutely. Well, okay, so now music education. So what do you think, in your opinion, defines a good musician?
What defines a good musician?
What defines a good musician?
Uh, Someone who can express themselves beautifully through music, you know? Someone, I mean, I don't know, that's such a big question. Because people have different ideas about it, you know? It's like, is it someone who can play super fast, you know? Like, that's not really what interests me necessarily as a musician. For me, it's about expressivity. It's about expression, and it's about nuance, and it's about personality, and having those things come across to the point where you're kind of forgetting what instrument that person even plays sometimes. You know what I mean? And it just sounds like their voice, or, you know, like someone like Monk, or, you know, or Fred is a great example. Fred Hirsch, you know, is like this like beautiful singing sound on the piano. It sounds vocal to me sometimes almost. He's so expressive, you know. These musicians who I like the most are just really expressive. You can really hear something of their heart and something of their soul come across in music. For me, I guess, you know, more important than like the blazing chops or the like being able to jump through the hoops of like all of these metric modulations and things like that. Like that kind of stuff oftentimes really does not interest me at all when I hear it. I tend to like stuff that's just, you know, that's got some feeling to it. And also like stuff that feels really good rhythmically, you know, people play great time, you know, I think that's super important too, like time.
You mentioned a lot of academic things, you know, let's say like time, right, and expression. What do you think, in your opinion, are the basic rudiments for piano players, for piano students? What are the rudiments? What is it that, you know, I should imagine if I'm a student, somebody mentions rudiments?
I mean, for me, it's like sound and touch are like right away the most important thing, because before anyone else hears any of the cool harmonies you're playing or any of those hip rhythms, you know, they're going to hear your sound. And if your sound is shitty, they're not going to want to listen to it, or at least I wouldn't want to. Many people, you know. So for me, sound is like, of course, the most important thing, because that's the fundamental, you know. And I'm still, you know, that's a lifelong process, working on how to get a beautiful sound out of the piano. You know, that's something pianists work on forever. My favorite pianists all have arrived at it. You know, I'm working on it, you know? But that is something that I really concentrate on. I never want to play something where the sound is harsh, or the sound, or it's not or edgy sounding. You know, I don't like. It doesn't sound right to me. You know. Yeah. So that, I mean, you know, obviously there's a million things to work on. There's no end to things to work on piano. But for me, like fundamentally, and I think that goes for any instrument. That goes for horn players. It goes for guitar players. You know. Guitar players fiddle around so much with all these pedals and everything, trying to get the right effect. And, you know, I get that, because what they're kind of trying to go for is like getting their sound right. you know, so like I can understand the struggle, but on piano, you don't have any, you know, you can't be like, oh, I should, you know, turn down my distortion pedal to get a better sound. You know what I mean? It's different, you know, it's a different approach.
Well, I like the variety of musicians you've worked with. So if you still go back to Fables, you chose these musicians. If you were to look for new musicians for your new project, what kind of qualities do you appreciate in a bass player and a drummer, maybe a trumpet player, or a saxophonist, or a vocalist? So what do you like about bass players?
Well, bass players also is like number one thing for me is like sound and intonation, you know. And rhythm, you know, so like, you know, and their touch, the way they sound on the bass, and playing a beautiful note in perfect intonation in great time, you know, like Orlando, like Matt Penman, like you know, Matt Brewer, like David Wong. There are so many players like that, you know, who like, for me, if you're the low rhythmic and harmonic part of the band, if you're aiming for those low notes and they're not in tune, that is a major problem, you know? Like that throws off the whole rest of the ensemble for me, you know? Some people are less sensitive to it than others, you know? But for me, like having a bass player who plays out of tune, I don't care how hip they're playing. If it's not in tune, it's a real drag, you know? And also bass players who play too loud. That's like a thing that really bugs me, you know? I'd way rather play, like 100 times out of 100, would rather play with a loud and busy drummer than with a loud bassist. There's something about the frequency of those like that. It just eats up like that, this whole spectrum of sound, like right in the low middle, that's impossible to fight, you know? Drummers, I mean, also like rhythmic inventiveness, their ability to interpret new music, you know, like Jonathan Blake is great at that, or, you know, or Mark Ferber is amazing at that. The people who can just like take your piece of music and go like, oh yeah, I feel like this is what should happen, you know? And they can add some like real inventiveness, you know, because I'm not always great at describing like what I feel like the drum part should be on a tune, which is why I hire drummers or like to work with drummers who I want to give that to them, you know? I want to give them that initial try at it, you know what I mean? But yeah, for me, it's always the same. It's like sound, touch, feel, you know, and that kind of inventiveness and propulsiveness to that only a drummer can really have, you know? So that's for the rhythm section, yeah. And then for like horn players or guitar players, you know, again, just that kind of expression. Like Seamus, for example, has the most beautiful sound. You know, it's very loud, but it's just gorgeous singing sound, and he's so lyrical, and you can sing everything that he plays, you know? You could sing along with it, like almost like it had lyrics sometimes, you know what I mean? So I like horn players who sound.
How well do you cope with stressful elements such as peer pressure, competition, fear of being good enough, and living up to your expectations?
I just think it's something that's very common in musicians. You're always worried about how other people are perceiving you, or you're worried about why you don't have this gig or that gig, you know, or you know, it's a very easy profession in which to become depressed or feel like you are not, you know, not living up to your potential or those sorts of things. So I definitely grapple with that. I go through periods where if I'm really busy and I have lots of cool shit to work on, then I feel great. You know what I mean? Because there's like no time to worry about what everyone else is doing and thinking. If I can, you know, if I can pour myself into the music that I'm working on or something that I'm working towards, that's great. On the other hand, if I have less going on, I can find that really hard psychologically, you know?
Yep.
And, you know, I also get, you know, yeah, I mean, you know, everyone wants to play more. Everyone wants to be on the road, like touring all over the place, playing great gigs and playing with the world's greatest musicians. But that happens to like a very tiny percentage of jazz musicians. Jazz musicians are a tiny, tiny percentage of the musicians in the world, and it's a profoundly unpopular art form. You know what I mean? So I think it's important to maintain some perspective about it, even though as difficult as it may be, even though we're doing it all the time. You know, it's important to kind of give yourself a break. You know, it's like it's a hard thing that we've chosen to do to become musicians, to try to play music for a living. I mean, no one's getting rich off it, really. Some people might be doing better than others, but everyone has their own struggles too. You know, maybe you're a musician and you are like on the road all the time and you never get to see your kids, or you have a shitty divorce because you never spend time with family. You know, there's like always going to be some downside to being super busy and super popular as a musician.
Absolutely.
So I try to that's how I kind of deal with some of those stresses, is I really try to keep them in perspective. But of course, it's not always easy to do. It's hard. And every gig is hard in its own way. Some, you know, we all have these dream gigs where everything goes perfectly, but there's always things that go wrong.
Have you had any physical injuries coming from maybe playing, but even if you had any sports injuries, and how did you treat them?
I haven't, very luckily, I haven't had too many injuries related to playing piano. I think when I was younger and my technique was not I hadn't really arrived at like a proper technique yet, and I was overplaying or playing too much, then I would develop some stiffness in my hand. I also, like when I was young, I was playing baseball and my right hand was broken by a baseball that was, so this hand is always like, even though I'm right-handed, like my right hand is always a little stiff and weird feeling. But yeah, the only real injuries, I mean, I've had some like kind of light tendonitis just from overplaying, or if I play too much on keyboards that aren't weighted, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
like if I'm playing organ or like a lot of like gigs on a keyboard that is just like where there's no weight, then I have a tendency to like maybe kind of overplay. That feels bad. But I feel like, again, like the more piano I play, I'm fine. I feel like I can practice for a long time. I should be practicing more all the time, but I feel like I can practice more on a piano without getting injuries at this point than when I was younger. Just because my technique is a little bit more together at this point, or I didn't even know if it's more together. But I've just found something that works for me a little better. You know.
And with the light tendonitis, did you have any, like your own treatment when you said, oh, maybe let's not play it? Every time you felt a little bit of pressure, you stopped playing, or did you even seek help from somebody?
I did. I did see a physical therapist briefly, and then I tried acupuncture, which really, I know that a lot of people have a lot of success with that, but it didn't do a ton for me. I feel like a lot of the problems just kind of work themselves out if I took a little bit of time off, which is lucky. I know that's not always the case with musicians who have injuries. A lot of them have really difficult problems to deal with. But I've found that like just generally some regular exercise, trying to get away from the piano and like going for a run or, doing some yoga or that sort of thing has gone a long way to, I think, preventing some of the injuries that a lot of musicians get, from me anyway.
Okay, that's very good advice with prevention. What about software for writing music?
So Sibelius for transcribing or for writing music, and then I use on certain gigs I have used the Mainstage program.
Well, let's say if I were a student in the fourth year when it's our final year and we are graduating, what words of wisdom would you give us?
I would find a group of musicians that you really enjoy playing with, your contemporaries, wherever you are, and just keep learning and growing with them. It's really important to do. You can't do this music in a test tube. I mean, of course it's important to practice, but you need, for me, like having, being in college and being around that community of musicians, the men and women that were interested in learning about this music, there was nothing more important than being able to play with them, interact with them. So that would be the number one thing that I would say. And then just like play as much as you can and listen to people who are older than you, who are better than you, and who can really play. Go and hear music as much as you can, because there's also no substitute for seeing and hearing the real thing, That's actually something really interesting I'm noticing about younger students now. It's like a lot of times I don't see them hanging out like in clubs. I don't see them like going to hear stuff. Like, what are you doing? They're like, well, it's all on YouTube.
It's all on YouTube, exactly.
It's like, and there's all these instructional videos on YouTube. I mean, that stuff has its time and place, don't get me wrong. It can be great, but there's no substitute for seeing and hearing the music live. And seeing the masters, like whatever that means to you. Like the best players in your town or the best players you can afford to go see when a jazz festival comes through, whatever. You gotta go hear that stuff. There's no substitute for that. So that those would be my words of wisdom.
It's very positive. It's actually very encouraging.